welcome to Uncommons, a podcast focused on Canadian politics. I'm your host, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. I'm also the Member of Parliament for Beaches East York. And today we're focused on COVID-19, but also a question of human rights. And we're joined by a really interesting guest, someone who I have looked up to and certainly leaned on as a Member of Parliament for human rights advice, Alex Neve, Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Alex.
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity, Nate.
And you have, your organization has, and you're leading that organization, have published a Toronto Star op-ed recently, but a more specific and detailed document putting human rights at the center of the COVID-19 response, and a manifesto of sorts of 10 points. And I want to get to that and focus most of our conversation there. But I also wanted to ask at the outset, just, you've lived a very interesting life focused on human rights, and in the role that you are in now, you obviously, that is the entirety of your focus as a professional. But how did you come to this focus on human rights? And before you were in the role that you're in, how much did you focus on human rights?
Well, it actually really did begin with Amnesty International. Many a moon ago when I was in law school, so this is back in the 1980s, I went into law school knowing that I very much wanted to be a lawyer working for social change in some way, but not really having a precise idea as to what that would look like. I went to Dalhousie University in Halifax, and one day walking past a notice board in the Student Union building, saw a poster advertising the monthly meeting of the local Amnesty International group, which I'd heard a little bit about, but didn't know a great deal about Amnesty. I was certainly interested enough that I went to the meeting. And I guess, we all have these moments in life which you never imagine are coming at you until they're there.
Right.
And that was one of those moments, because it really completely changed the course of my life. I think, number one, the Amnesty message of activism, which in the mid-'80s certainly resonated, and I think very much does today as well, that it's a big, sometimes very ugly world out there with huge problems that often seem overwhelming. And it's very easy, therefore, to imagine that there's nothing that I, as an individual, could possibly do to affect change. And in the midst of that, Amnesty comes with offerings, says,
exactly.
You know what? Here's one thing you can do right now. Yes, the problems are big, but here's one thing you can do right now to make a difference for one prisoner or to try to get rid of one bad law. And that was so appealing. And the other side,
I remember sitting in a church basement a number of years ago, writing letters as part of an Amnesty campaign. And all my thoughts went to, is this going to make a difference? And then immediately thought, well, it has previously. Not in all instances does it make a difference, but these campaigns, they sometimes do.
Yeah. Well, advocacy, whether it is that tried and true write a letter style of advocacy, or all the other ways in which advocacy has grown so much in the nearly 60 years that Amnesty's been around now, it does certainly make a difference. Sometimes very direct, that cascade of letters does open a prison cell door and someone is freed. Other times it's intangible and indirect. It's laying the ground. It's starting to shift attitudes, build pressure such that, 6 months or 2 years down the road, there will be change. And I think what you really have to hold on to is what we do know is that staying silent will never affect change. So certainly in whatever way it's possible to use your voice, it absolutely makes a difference.
And could you have ever imagined when you first went to that meeting that you would then have the role that you have today?
I certainly couldn't have imagined. And, and here it is. I've been in this role for 20 years. And I think that Amnesty meeting was probably a good 35, 36 years ago. And it's just been the greatest honor I could possibly imagine. The people I get to work with, the vital and important issues that I've been able to link arms with other activists and try to affect change. It's been so fulfilling, so meaningful, and so incredibly humbling.
Well, without question, you are in the arena, as it were. And so, in terms of the issues that you have been focused on, there are so many, and yet we face a crisis at the moment. And you have inserted your voice, as you do, to say human rights should be at the center of government's response and society's response to COVID-19. Now, the correspondence that I receive in my office is focused on the negative economic fallout and focused on increasing testing capacity and how do we ensure that we are getting through this and addressing this from a healthcare perspective. And so why human rights? Why put human rights at the center of this crisis?
I guess I would begin by noting that both of those issues that are constituting the bulk of what you're hearing about in your office are the human rights side of this as well. I think often when people hear that the human rights advocates are showing up to engage in debate, that it's usually that we're there to stop the government from doing and to criticize abuses and excesses. And obviously that is a very important part of human rights work. But an absolutely crucial part of human rights work is also calling on governments to do something, to act, to respond. And I think both of those issues, the economic hardship and the ways in which that has devastating impact on people's livelihoods, their abilities to pay their rent, to meet their basic needs. There's several internationally protected human rights that are right at the heart of that, and government has an obligation to make sure those rights are being protected. And then the second area, the pandemic itself, this cruel virus and the risk it poses both to people's health, but of course, in far too many cases, to their very lives. That too is an essential internationally protected right, and two key rights there: the right to health in numerous international human rights treaties, and the right to life, perhaps the most central and essential right of all. So it begins there in us saying governments must respond to this crisis because human rights are at stake. Now, yes, obviously we're seeing those responses, certainly right across Canada, but there's many governments around the world which were very slow off the mark. We even heard some leaders, of course, referring to it all as a hoax and trying to be dismissive. And there's a human rights critique when we see governments failing to take action here as well. So it begins right where you're hearing from your constituents.
I found it interesting. You have 10 points in the calls to government to put, and really more broadly than government, to society, I would say, to put human rights at the center of the response to COVID-19. And the second point is the traditional strict limits to protect civil liberties that any government intervention, be it travel restrictions or other restrictions in people's mobility and freedom, should be necessary and proportionate, and there's a strict limits through which we are able to restrict people's rights as a matter of negative rights in sort of a more legalistic way. You mentioned the word positive in your encapsulation of rights in that first instance there, and so I think it's interesting. Sometimes as a lawyer, we have this debate about negative and positive rights. It's nice to, as be in Parliament sometimes, to not have to worry about that conversation so much, to say what is enforceable in court and what, I mean, really, as a parliamentarian and looking at spending money and looking at putting measures in place to support people, I can freely be focused on positive rights and to say, how do we best realize people's right to health? How do we best realize people's right to life? And it's not just about how do we protect people's rights in the course of restricting them as best as we can, but also how do we best realize and make sure people, the government supports are there to make sure we're realizing them in the most fulsome way that we possibly can. And that's, I like that was point number one on your list of 10 points. You've been a critical. You joined us in November of 2017 at a church where we did a town hall here in Beaches, East York, and you were very critical then of the xenophobia coming from the United States and the leadership in the United States. I expect you would have the same criticism when we look at the health response and the right to health sitting here today.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly that is one of the key principles we've highlighted. That very early on we saw that the pandemic was being either used as an excuse or certainly was fueling ongoing racism and xenophobia. Famously, of course, we have President Trump, who consistently continues to refer to it as the Chinese virus. But there's manifestations of that at all levels. We know that right-wing groups using it as an opportunity to scapegoat and even carry out attacks against refugees and migrants. Right. Certainly, there's been many reports right around the world, including even some in Canada, of people of East Asian or Chinese descent being physically assaulted in some instances, or at least mocked or called names, even sometimes kids in playgrounds. That's obviously all very, very troubling. There's never an excuse for that. And it's, I think, really important to be reminding all of us collectively, but certainly our political leaders, of how important it is, certainly not to be pandering to that in any way, exactly. But also to be stepping up and calling it out and making it clear that there's no space for that at all.
We had that happen. There was a local business owner, flower shop, and owned by an Asian family, and there was racism directed towards them by someone who popped into the store and used derogatory language, and it was horrible. And yet there are these moments in time where the thing that happens is awful and should be condemned, but so much depends upon the response. And so we saw the community respond in a very positive way to support that family. And as a society, I think you're right, call it out, and then also wrap around those people to provide the supports necessary and lift them up as best as we can.
I think that's a really important point that, yeah, I mean, yes, obviously, when we're talking about human rights obligations and responsibilities, we quite readily focus on the government, and we should. They have obligations, responsibilities, they have resources, they're the ones who have the power to enact laws, etc. But human rights more broadly, including in how it's framed in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are absolutely clear that it's about all of us, that we have a collective responsibility to make sure that rights are upheld. And it's in moments like that, when we witness or become aware of racism in our community, that we all have the opportunity to take on that role.
And I think there are those specific instances, and then even more broadly, when we look at the economic fallout, you use the words collective responsibility, and then also the word solidarity in the document. And I don't know that there's been any other moment in time in my life I'm 35 years. And so maybe there are moments in time for people who have lived through other crises, but there's been no other moment of time where that language of collective and solidarity has meant more.
I think that's true. I mean, I think you're right to point to the fact that it's often something we see when a terrible crisis, whether it's a hurricane or a public health crisis of this sort, or many other instances, we see the very best in people. People rally to help their neighbor and even to make sure they're there to help people they don't know. But I guess what is so different about COVID is we've never really, including in my 57 years, longer than your 35 years, had a crisis of this sort, which literally is impacting every corner of the world at the same time. And we're therefore seeing that global sense of solidarity. It's not just localized where a flood or a hurricane has happened. It truly is people all over the world finding ways to come together, show direct support to healthcare workers, show support to families that are facing the impact of the virus firsthand, and to just generally be there for each other to kind of boost morale and lift spirits.
So it's a good point, because the virus is indiscriminate. It affects all people. No one is immune, as it were, and yet there are certain more vulnerable populations in our society. And at number 3 in your list, you note the importance of responding to better address and to in the course of our responses, we help everyone. We make note of the fact that certain communities will need special help. And when I go through that list, I'm comforted in some ways by the government's response, I have to say. So the first is extra measures for Indigenous communities, including remote communities. And we saw $305 million more dollars specifically directed in the phase one measure of support that the government's announced. You have domestic violence on your list, and we saw supports additional just over $50 million for sexual assault centers and support groups in that way. You have homelessness, inadequate housing on your list. Obviously, evictions are a provincial issue, which the provincial government in Ontario, to its credit, has said there's going to be a moratorium on evictions. And then we have $150 some odd million to focus specifically on our homeless population. Precariously employed, we've expanded well beyond the EI. So I go through the list and I'm comforted in many respects. And then I get to a couple of touch points that I struggle with. One, the prison population. I think it's fair to say we haven't sufficiently acted quickly enough to address the vulnerabilities of the prison population. And maybe you could speak to that. But the one that really stands out to me, and I wonder what your thoughts are, but you have refugee claimants. And previously you have been a very vocal critic of the Safe Third Country Agreement. And now we see on a temporary basis, Canada, maybe for good public health reasons, at the end of the day, say temporarily, we are going to close down all irregular border crossings and everyone's going to be returned to the US. And now the media is reporting that those individuals are going to be deported and potentially, in some cases, put at risk of, their lives will be at risk. And so as I go to, I listed a number of positive aspects of the government's response, but there's one that doesn't coincide and there's one, it doesn't meet the criteria I think you're setting out for ourselves in the course of a human rights response.
Absolutely. Well, maybe a couple of points on this topic. I think it's really good that you've highlighted principle number 3 about vulnerable communities, because in many respects, that probably goes to the heart of why a human rights response to the crisis matters so much, because this is all about ensuring that as governments do respond, no one's going to be left behind. And in particular, that those who almost always are left behind and have already been left behind are going to get the special attention and assistance and deliberate action that's so necessary. And yes, absolutely, there's been some positive announcements made with respect to a number of the communities that we've highlighted. Obviously, the promise that money will be there is part one. Part two then becomes, will it roll out effectively? Yeah. Will it be implemented in the right kind of consultation with the affected communities, et cetera? I think we also, in a number of these areas, see that thorny issue that often arises in Canada when both federal, provincial, territorial, and even municipal governments have a piece of the puzzle. How well coordinated is it? Is it going to be consistent right across the country? So something like homelessness and housing, for instance. And I think there's an important role for the Canadian government to step in and make sure that's the case. But you're right as well to highlight that there are, I think, some particular issues we flagged there where we're not yet seeing the kind of encouraging announcements and policy change that we should. So, for instance, with respect to prisons and jails and immigration detention centers, or have seen policies announced which quite directly contravene key human rights protections, and that decision to close down the Canada-US border to all refugee claimants, no matter where and how they're trying to cross the border from the US into Canada, and force them back to remain in the United States, where even before the COVID crisis came along, there was a full-out assault on the safety, dignity, and rights of refugees and migrants in the United States, and that is only becoming tenfold worse now in the time of COVID in the United States, with all sorts of both rhetoric and policy developments from the White House. So it is very concerning. You asked about, is it possibly the right public health response? Well, it's not, and in fact, ironically, the government's first announcement in this area did have it right on both fronts, and that was that refugee claimants would be allowed to cross the border, but that they would be forced into self-isolation for 14 days to monitor for health issues, and thus by being allowed in, our refugee protection obligations were being met. By adopting that 14-day self-isolation requirement, our public health obligations were being met. Now, by closing down the border, the possibility that people will nonetheless find, if sufficiently fearful or desperate, that they are nonetheless going to cross the border and find a way into Canada. How does that solve public
Right.
health concerns there? And for those who now just feel stymied and feel unable to cross the border, then they're going to face the hostility, the rights violations, and quite frankly, the likelihood of a rapidly worsening situation in the United States. So this is certainly an area of considerable disappointment.
I was in Washington a couple of years ago, and I met representatives from the ACLU to talk about the American experience in how, talked about kids in cages, but the American experience with managing the inflow of asylum claimants and how they were providing fairness in that system, and the answer was really not at all, and that the due process was already under some strain, even under the Obama years, and the Trump administration was proactively removing additional due process protections. And it is concerning, obviously, at the best of times, and at the worst of times, in a crisis like this, obviously our attention is focused on health, and not as many people are writing emails as previously about the Safe Third Country Agreement, but it is of concern when we are able to. The first question I would have is, do we have the capacity to manage the inflow in a way that is consistent with the best public health advice? And to your point, if we are able to make sure that people are isolated and detained in some fashion in isolation for the 14-day window, if we don't have that capacity, then we can have a different conversation. But if we do have that capacity, then it strikes me as a measure that is then not consistent with public health advice, and certainly inconsistent with our human rights obligations. And so then these competing principles aren't even necessarily in conflict. To the extent that they are in conflict and that we don't have those resources, then I think the focus and the silver lining in all of this becomes the temporal restriction. So this is only so long as the crisis lasts, and then the key focus, I think, of human rights advocates, if we are unsuccessful in shifting this in the interim, is to say, when this is over, we damn well better change things back to where they were before.
And I think that's a really important point to pick up on, because from time immemorial in Canada and around the world, there's a very troubling tendency that when we have a bit of a rollback on rights, when we have restrictions on rights which are brought in because of a crisis, the national security crisis that followed September the 11th would be a great example.
Sure.
That what we tend to see is that becomes the new normal, and the hope and expectation that after a very short period of time, those restrictions on rights that we reluctantly accepted in time of crisis become part of the landscape is very common, or at least we don't fully go back to where things were before. And I guess one of the concerning things here is we know that there has been some interest, including within the current government, but certainly from some of the other federal parties, in trying to find a way to entirely shut down the Canada-US border, not just at official border posts, but the entire border to refugee claimants coming in from the United States. And this becomes that opening. So you're quite right. I think it'll be incumbent upon all of us at a minimum, if we can't see this provision withdrawn right now, to make sure that it is not going to last beyond the initial 30 days that it's been designated for.
Right, exactly. And I don't think I'm going to get to all 10 of your principles and points in the putting human rights at the center of the COVID-19 response, but we did cover off racism and xenophobia to some extent. Obviously, talked about the absurdity of continued reference to the Chinese virus. We've seen, I mean, this is just an extension of the xenophobia we've seen from the administration in the U.S. in recent years. But number 4 is actually a gender-based analysis Plus, and we've just started to receive email campaigns talking about putting a feminist lens on the response. And I think a number of the asks are emergency childcare for essential workers. We've also seen a request for paid sick leave. And obviously that in the current context, we can't put that onus on businesses. There would have to be government funds that would be helping businesses provide for that. But then we've also seen demand or a request for billions of dollars in assistance for the charities and nonprofit sector on the basis that I think disproportionately a number of women are working in the not-for-profit sector. And do you have, I mean, question whether this is, I don't maybe this is an Amnesty campaign, I don't know, but do you have a sense of where that GBA analysis leads us?
Well, I would first highlight it. It isn't just GBA analysis. It's what's increasingly now referred to as GBA Plus, which is actually very importantly recognizing that there's a number of intersecting identities, gender, race, people living with disabilities, quite a long list. And that's really important because it's often at the intersection of those identities where the concerns are even graver. This is absolutely vital here. I mean, you've started to go through a list of the ways in which absolutely there's aspects of this pandemic which are disproportionately going to have an impact on women. We could do the same thing with respect to other identities as well. And if there's not deliberate assessment of that to make sure that as decisions are being made, as funding is being allocated, that's driving how priorities are set, how the programs are delivered, to make sure that those vulnerabilities aren't overlooked, or that it's not just assumed that somehow if this applies to everyone, then they will be fine as well. Then I think we're really going to miss the boat. And going back to that key human rights message I said earlier about how the crucial reason that human rights needs to be at the table right now is making sure that no one is left behind. And it's through a real commitment to GBA Plus analysis now that we get there.
And you mentioned a couple of times leaving no one behind, and we've talked in a domestic context. But if we get to later, you talk about international cooperation, and there's a special responsibility to help other states. I would go further. I don't think it's necessarily about helping other states per se. I mean, some states are really terrible administrations, but it's about helping people in other states who all the more so needing to help them because their states are so oppressive and do not respect human rights in a way that we try to, don't always don't always do so in the best way. But when we look to that obligation, that international obligation, you mentioned it in the context of international cooperation, but I mean, we have the absurdity on the one hand of some, it tends to be conservative politicians who say, we've got to protect people at home and we can't be sending resources abroad, to the point that even resources to the World Health Organization in the context of a pandemic were panned as dollars that should have been kept in Canada, which seems right absurd to me. But we do have a special, so it's not just about leaving no one behind here in Canada. It's got to also about leaving no one behind around the world. This is a pandemic that the world faces.
Absolutely. And again, I think that's one of the really important aspects that gets priority attention when you bring a human rights perspective to this, because human rights are universal. Human rights aren't just ours as Canadians, and we as Canadians are not only obliged or encouraged to look after human rights within our own border. We all have a universal responsibility. And at a time like this, could there be any starker illustration of the fact that when it comes to human rights, there's no such thing as borders? This is something that has spanned the world rapidly, that is impacting everyone, that has in some aspects been carried from country to country by travel. And it really highlights how directly interconnected and intertwined we are, and that surely no meaningful solution here is going to take us back to a place of safety and good health if we've not been able to do that for the entire world. And we, as a prosperous country, therefore have a clear, extra special responsibility to step up and make sure that that strong global response is happening. And for a country that even in the best of times has not yet lived up to the suggested targets of 0.7% of our gross national income as an international aid target, this certainly is the time to give that a rethink.
Both from there's a moral human rights component to this. There's also just a basic national security or domestic security element to this as well when we talk about the connected nature of our world. And no better illustration than the wide and unpoliceable border as between the United States and Canada, where we have right now the United States administration, I think, failing to take the serious action that they need to take from a health perspective. And that, because of our interconnectedness, jeopardizes Canadians. That we need all countries to do their part, or or it puts the rest of us at jeopardy.
I think that's absolutely true. Let's imagine that COVID-19 somehow gets banished in all countries but one, and that it's still ravaging that one particular country. Well, then none of us are safe if that's the case. If there's truly going to be the kind of progress towards having addressed the incredible health concerns that come with COVID, that means addressing it everywhere. There's no way around that.
So I want to close. We've talked largely about the human rights response in the context of COVID-19, and yet you close out the document. Point number 10 is the human rights agenda in the longer term. And you highlight a number of different aspects, including what I think is the number one priority, but it's focused on the other long-term crises, or this is the long-term crises, I think, of our time, which is climate change. And you speak to laying the groundwork for a carbon neutral economy, which I think is absolutely right. You speak to other long-term focuses for a human rights agenda as well. And so I think it would be nice to close just both what should we be looking to on the outside of this, however long this lasts, but on the outside of this for that long-term human rights agenda broadly for all of us. And then personally, I'd be interested, just because you had mentioned being part of Amnesty International and the role that you've been in for so many years, but that role is coming to an end. And so do you have a sense of what lies next, not only for the broader human rights agenda, but also for yourself personally?
So I think this aspect of where next for human rights after the COVID crisis is vital, and I think many people have been talking about this in all sorts of different ways. That this is certainly a wake-up call, but also that it's an incredibly important opportunity for a global reset in how we are as an international community, societies everywhere. That clearly this is pointing out to us that there's so much that is unsustainable, unjust, and dangerous about how we've been living our lives, how we've been on this ramped up, accelerating road of growth for so long now. And as we do, obviously right now, everyone is understandably focused on the day-to-day or even the hour-to-hour challenges of the crisis. But pretty soon, as we start to come out of this, we need to have some very serious conversations about change, substantial, real change that addresses issues like global healthcare reform, that really gets at the serious concerns around poverty and homelessness in our world, the gender inequality gap that is still pervasive everywhere, and certainly the one that you've highlighted, the global climate crisis, where it's kind of been parked in some respects, but that is not going away, and we're going to have to make some major changes very rapidly to address that as well.
But perhaps if there's any lesson in some ways out of this, to see the incredibly significant mobilization that we have seen internationally, cooperatively in many respects in tackling COVID-19, that we carry those lessons and that mobilization through to other crises. So maybe there's some silver lining in that respect as well. And then for you personally, what comes next?
So I am set to move on from this amazing honor I've had of being Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada for 20 years as of June 30th. That doesn't mean by any means that I'm retiring from human rights work. I'm not at the age that I'm seeking retirement yet. But how could anyone, especially everything that has come at us in these last few weeks in this crisis, walk away from human rights work? The challenges are immense, but I think, as we've also just been noting, the openings and the opportunities are profound right now. And so I certainly imagine continuing to be part of that, still working out, from where and in what capacity. But this is by no means a time in any way to be walking away from human rights work.
Well, I will, so long as I'm in Parliament, I will keep leaning on your advice as well when it comes to human rights and beyond. And so I want to thank you for all of your advocacy and especially for joining me today. Thanks, Alex.
Great. It was a good conversation. Thanks, Nate.